The Apache woman begged in tears, "Don't spend money on me." But the poor farmer gave his only gun. That was what the papers in the East said about a man who'd wasted his survival on a woman he barely knew. But the truth I lived through, was a damn sight harder. And the woman I found never begged a day in her life. She was a silent, unbroken storm. The auction in Los Seamus had already been going for an hour when Daniel Ward stepped into the market square. That was the story they told. My story, the one that broke what little spirit I had left, began later that same blistering summer in a hellhole called Dusk Ridge, Arizona, and I walked in not for seed, but for a tin of powder and a quiet end to my trail. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The dust in Dusk Ridge didn't just hang in the air. It felt like powdered rust, staining everything. It settled on the sweat-caked shirts of the miners, on the peeling paint of the saloon, and on my own worn-out boots as I stepped off the boardwalk. I wasn't there for trouble. At 65 years old, my trouble was behind me, buried deep under years of bad whiskey and the bitter taste of a promise broken and never forgotten. I needed powder for my old Sharps rifle. One last box. Then maybe I'd ride up into the Mogollon Rim and find a place quiet enough to wait for the end. The shouting dragged me toward the center of the square. It wasn't the usual noise, not the drunken brawling or the high-pitched screams of a poker game gone sour. This was the slick, oily sound of commerce, twisting something human into a ledger entry. Beside the assay office, a makeshift platform had been thrown together. On it stood a man whose face was too fat for his collar, sweat glistening on his shaved head. Bartholomew Bart Gunn, the auctioneer, a man who traded in human desperation. And beside him stood Hare. She was Apache. Not just a woman, but a shadow carved from the canyons of the Southwest, her skin the color of desert clay at sunset. She wore nothing but tattered buckskin, and the rope binding her wrists to the rail was a thick, cheap thing, already cutting into her flesh. The sun beat down, turning the dust around her feet into shimmering heat. The crowd of men below miners, shiftless cowboys, and the kind of low-life scum that Dusk Ridge attracted were yelling obscenities, pointing, their faces flushed with greed and something darker. But she wasn't crying. She held her head high, the dark curtain of her hair falling over one shoulder. Her jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle working beneath her skin. Her eyes, when she lifted them, weren't glassed over with tears or fear. They were like obsidian chips, sharp, unflinching, and filled with a cold, terrifying contempt. She refused to give them the release of her pain. I stopped dead in my tracks. The auctioneer, Bart Gunn, was shouting, "Look at the spirit, unbroken, strong enough to work, strong enough to warm. Who'll give me $100, gentlemen? $100 for this piece of prime desert property." The bidding was slow, cruel, focused on breaking her pride. Each dollar was a cut, a reminder that her freedom was less valuable than a good pack mule. The woman, I heard someone hiss her name, Si-Ta, Daystar. The crowd laughed at the name, but to me, it felt like a silent, terrible indictment. I didn't care about the powder, or the end, or my own meager future. My problem wasn't survival, it was the past. For 15 long years, I'd carried the face of Corporal Finn with me. Finn, my young rider, who died in the Apache Wars protecting a patch of desert he never knew, whispering a desperate plea as he bled out, "Promise me, Jake. Promise me you'll remember why we fight. Not for the gold, but for the decency. Don't let my death be for nothing." Decency. The word felt like a lie in this sun-baked square. But when I saw the absolute refusal in her eyes, the dignity she clung to, I heard Finn's voice like a bullet to the chest. My hand went to my side, touching the smooth, cold handle of my single possession of worth, the Colt Peacemaker, a presentation model with a silver engraving Finn's gun, given to me before he fell. It was all I had left of my honor, all I had left of the man I used to be. It was my sole retirement fund, my final defense against a lawless world. Bart Gunn slammed his hand on the platform. $75. Last call at 75. Going once, going twice. My hand rose, slow, stiff with years of arthritis and regret. $100. The voice was mine, but it sounded alien, ragged. The crowd went silent, then erupted in a wave of mockery and disbelief. I was Jake Barlow, the dried-up relic who lived like a hermit, too poor to afford a decent meal, and I'd just thrown down the value of my entire life. "Look at the old fool, buying trouble with his pension," someone yelled, their laughter harsh and cruel. Bart Gunn's grin widened, revealing a gold tooth. He saw the quality of the gun in my holster, even if he didn't recognize the old man standing there. A gentleman's bid. Jake Barlow, going for the $100 to the cowboy with the shiny iron. I kept my eyes on Sita. She finally looked directly at me. Her obsidian gaze didn't hold gratitude. It held a terrible, quiet warning. Her lips barely moved, a whispered sound lost in the wind. "Why? Don't spend your survival on me." I didn't answer. Honor wasn't a word you spoke out loud. It was something you did, even if it meant your ruin. I drew the Colt Peacemaker from my holster and laid it on the auction block, the silver glinting in the sun, a reflection of my broken oath. "The gun," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's worth more than the 100. The difference buys the rope off her wrists and keeps your filthy hands off her." The silence returned, deeper this time. A presentation Colt Peacemaker was the ultimate sacrifice of a man whose only value lay in his ability to fight. I was trading my life for hers. A shadow fell over the platform. Sheriff Marcus Thorne, a mountain of fat and malice, detached himself from the saloon doorway and strolled over, his star badge gleaming like a lie. Thorne ran Dusk Ridge like a wolf runs a sheep pen. He stopped beside Gunn, looking down at the weapon, then at me. "That's a fine piece," Barlow, Thorne drawled, chewing on a wad of tobacco. "You sure you want to trade your livelihood for this?" "Squaw, the value is not equal, and the market is rigged, Jake." "The deal is done, Sheriff," I said, my gaze steady. "The property is bought. My right. Or is your law weaker than a piece of paper, Thorne?" Thorne smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. "The law is flexible in Dusk Ridge, Jake, but I'll take the gun, and you'll remember who runs the law around here. This isn't over." He picked up the Colt, turning it in his massive hand, his eyes savoring the weight of the silver. Then, with a curt nod to Gunn, the deal was sealed. Gunn sliced the rope from Sita's wrists with a rusty knife. The rope fell away to leave angry red welts across her dark skin. "Get off the block, woman," Gunn sneered. Sita didn't move fast. She stepped down from the platform with the same cold dignity she'd held throughout the ordeal, not stumbling, despite her bare feet hitting the rough dirt. She walked straight past the auctioneer and the sheriff, her eyes fixed only on me. I pulled off my heavy duster, the only good coat I owned, and wrapped it around her shoulders, covering the tattered buckskin and the raw rope burns. I didn't touch her, only nodded toward the dusty trail leading out of town. "We ride," I said. She followed. Her silence was louder than the jeers and the low, cruel laughter that rose from the crowd. I heard the whispers. "Old fool's bought his own death warrant. She's Apache trouble. Thorne will come for them both." I didn't turn back. I had traded my gun for a woman's freedom, and my survival for a fragment of my honor. The emptiness in my holster was cold, a stark reminder of the sacrifice. But when I felt her shadow fall into step behind me, the weight on my chest, the suffocating weight of my long-held regret lifted, just enough to let me breathe. We walked toward the waiting, worn-out gelding, and the silence between us stretched, not with fear, but with a tension that felt like the cocking of a rifle ready for whatever came next. "Bốn, viết đoạn 21.300 chữ." We rode out of Dusk Ridge on that tired old horse, the silence between us so brittle it felt like dried river stone. My holster was empty, and the only sound was the jingle of the bit and the soft shuffle of Sita's bare feet, where she sometimes touched the ground as we walked. She sat behind me, holding the back of the saddle, the duster wrapped tight. I kept my eyes on the trail that wounded through the dry scrub and low, red rock formations. I didn't ask her name again, didn't ask her story. She was a debt paid, an act of honor, and that was all I needed to know. The rest was hers to offer or to keep. My cabin was a shack, 3 miles out, not a home, but a place where a man could wait for winter and his own quiet demise. It stood against the horizon, rough logs, a patched roof, and fields that had yielded nothing but stones and bitter dust for 5 years. When we reached it, the sun was sinking, painting the sky in colors too beautiful for the ugly world beneath it. "This is your place?" she asked, her voice low, a dry whisper, the first word she'd spoken to me since the block. "What's left of it," I admitted, swinging down. I offered my hand. She hesitated, her eyes scanning my face, searching for a lie, for a catch, for the expectation of payment. The look was not one of fear, but of profound distrust, earned from years of betrayal. Her palm, when she finally laid it in mine, was rough, yet small, and I felt the faint ridges of the rope burns. I only guided her to the ground. My hand was steady, scarred from years of work, offering only a single, silent promise: safety. Inside, the cabin was as bare as my life, a narrow cot, a rusted stove, and a few tins of beans and coffee. I pointed to the cot. "You rest. Tomorrow, we work." Simple words. A command born of the old-school man I still tried to be. She didn't take the bed. She sat on the floor, huddled near the cold stove, my coat still around her. She was a wild thing, brought into a cage, and she didn't know yet whether the bars were steel or shadow. I lay on the cot, the cold emptiness of the leather holster still a phantom weight on my hip, listening to her quiet, steady breathing. And for the first time since Finn died, the silence wasn't all mine. The next morning, work began. I went for water. She followed, never more than 10 feet behind me. I split wood. She stacked it with a meticulous, careful motion that showed deep respect for the resource. I saw the blisters rise on her hands, but she didn't complain, didn't stop. She worked like someone who knew that labor was the only path to earned rest. I found an old pair of boots for her, too big, but better than the cold ground. She accepted them with a slight nod. No thanks needed, the transaction complete. Days melted into a week. The tension between us was a third body in the room, unspoken, demanding respect. I never asked about the river where she was taken, never asked about her people. I only watched her hands, which were quick and strong, repairing a strap on the old mule's harness with fine stitches that shamed my own rough leatherwork. I knew then, with the quiet conviction of an old man, that I hadn't bought a slave. I'd found a partner. The false sense of victory, the belief that the matter was settled once I rode out of Dusk Ridge, shattered on the 10th night. It was just past midnight. The moon was a sliver of silver light over the desolate landscape. I woke not to noise, but to the scent of wood smoke and whiskey. Sita was already awake, standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the pale light, her silence warning me before the dogs did. 3 riders, Thorne's men. I moved to the door, pulling my old hunting knife from my boot. Without the Colt, I was a scarecrow with a piece of steel. "Sheriff Thorne sends his regards. Barlow," a voice snarled from the darkness. It was Dusty, a known gun hand and a bully in Dusk Ridge. "He says you bought that squaw with stolen property. The gun was never yours to trade. He wants the girl back, or he wants $500 for the inconvenience." $500. It might as well have been 5,000. They weren't looking for money. They were looking for a chance to take her and settle the score with the old man who had dared challenge the order of their town. They were the complication I hadn't foreseen. I stepped out, into the light, thrown by a half-full moon. The wind was cold. "She's not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the cold dread in my gut. "That's the law, old man." Dusty laughed, drawing a pistol. "The law says property stays with the strong. You broke the law of the Wild West the second you spent that silver." They threw a torch at the corner of my lean-to. The dry wood caught instantly, sending flames licking into the night. I charged, knowing I was already beaten. I slashed at the nearest horse, forcing it to rear, buying a second of chaos. Dusty fired, the bullet tearing through the air where my head had been moments before. I was an old man, and without my gun, my dignity was all I had left. I fought like an animal, not for victory, but for a good, clean fight. My knife found skin, but their pistol butts found bone. I was beaten down, my ribs protesting, my arm gashed by a stray bullet. They weren't trying to kill me, not yet. They wanted to make a point. As they rode away, shouting that they'd be back with Thorn himself, I was left lying in the dust, the scent of burning wood and shame heavy in the air. The lean-to was lost, but the cabin stood. Sita helped me inside, her movements quick and efficient, binding my wounds with strips of cloth I hadn't even known I possessed. I watched her, my breath ragged. "They will return," she stated, not a question, but a cold fact. I know. My failure was a bitter taste. I had sacrificed my only means of defense for her freedom, and now that very act of honor had brought the full weight of organized evil crashing down on us. This was the devastating setback. I looked at the walls of my cabin, my last sanctuary, and realized I could not protect her here. My initial act of honor had been a false victory. I had bought her freedom, but I hadn't earned our safety. The stakes had been raised. The conflict was no longer about a debt or a gun. It was about life, and the extratai more to do, justice, I still owed Finn. And now, to her. Dusk Ridge and Thorn were coming for us, and the only path left was the open desert, the perilous, unforgiving West. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. Banum. Viết đoạn 3.1300 chữ. The last hours before dawn stretched thin like a fraying rope, the sky above us still heavy with darkness and stars, the kind of darkness that felt borrowed, stolen, as if the desert itself might snatch it back any second. My ribs ached with every breath sharp, bruising pain radiating like a warning from inside my chest, but that was nothing compared to the heavier weight pressing down on me, the shame of knowing I had failed to keep us safe. We had fled with almost nothing, our lives crammed into a few meager objects, a strip of dried venison wrapped in cloth, a canteen sloshing with brackish water that smelled faintly of iron, and the bitter knowledge that every mile we put between ourselves and Dusk Ridge drove us deeper into the unforgiving New Mexico Badlands. Out here, even the wind had a knife's edge. My horse, a tired old gelding named Rust, whose chestnut coat had dulled to a dusty brown, was our only hope of outrunning what hunted us. We rode east, the horizon still black, and Sita sat silent behind me, a fierce and steady warmth against my back. Her hands clutched the saddle horn with a calmness that shamed me. Somewhere in that midnight flight, she had stitched the tear in my duster with a skill that defied the darkness, her fingers precise and quick even as the horse jolted beneath us. I knew, with the kind of certainty that sticks in your bones, that she was the strength in that moment, not me. I was the one who had drawn the attention of the snake, and now I had dragged her into the viper's nest. That thought that my decency had become her doom was the real burden, heavier than my empty holster, and the useless ache in my ribs. The first hint of sun rose violent and orange over the red rock mesas, spilling light like molten copper across the land. The desert revealed itself in cruel beauty, a place where a man's sins could be baked clean under the sun, but where his mistakes were carved larger, etched in shadow on every canyon wall. Rust snorted, ears flicking, and I patted his sweat-darkened neck. We rode hard until the gelding was lathered and trembling, then dismounted to lead him through the deep arroyos, boots sinking into sand, crossing treacherous slick rock that glittered under the newborn light. The silence between us had vanished, not replaced by words, but by something older, a shared language of gesture, warning, and grim determination. The tilt of a head, the tightening of a hand on the reins, the slow scan of a canyon rim, these were our words now. We were isolated, cut off. No help would come. Thorn's power extended far beyond the limits of Dusk Ridge, stretching across county lines and riverbeds like barbed wire. He was fueled by greed and the absolute certainty that in the wilderness his word was law, backed by men who carried rifles and grinned at their own cruelty. It was mid-morning when we first heard them, the riders. Not 3, as I had expected, but 5. Thorn was serious now. He wanted what he called his property back, and he wanted my humiliation to be a spectacle, whispered about at every saloon table from Santa Fe to Silver City. We were nothing but a worn-out man and a dispossessed woman against the organized might of a corrupt town. The math of it was sickening. We ducked into a narrow canyon wash, its sheer walls of sandstone offering a brief, dusty sanctuary. Rust stumbled as I pulled him to a halt, his sides heaving. My own legs shook with exhaustion as we slid down into the cooler shade. Sita pressed herself against the canyon wall, her braid falling over one shoulder, her eyes scanning the rim above like a hawk. She read the land as if it were a book written in her first language, each ridge a sentence, each rockfall a warning. She had lost her people, her freedom, and now perhaps her life, all because of my momentary act of decency. That truth scalded me worse than the Sunday. It was there, in the dust and breathless heat of that canyon, that she finally broke the silence. Her words came like a blade sliding between my ribs. "They want me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. "They want the property. They do not need the old man who paid for it." "Oh." I turned to her, my blood turning cold, a chill in the desert heat. She was giving me a choice, a way out. "I can go back," she continued, her eyes holding mine dark, clear, unyielding. "You showed honor. You fulfilled your debt to your dead friend. You can ride away now. Your life is yours to keep." The moral dilemma struck like a physical blow. My chest tightened, and the breath caught halfway, just like it had back at the auction when I first laid down the money. She was offering to sacrifice herself to return to the darkness so that I could survive. This was the ultimate test of the honor I claimed to embody. I clenched my hands, dirt grinding beneath my nails. If I accepted, I'd live, but I'd lose the last shred of my self-respect, cementing my image as a coward who valued his skin over his promise. I would break Finn's trust for the second, final time. My flaw had caused the major crisis. To accept her offer now would make it permanent. "No," I growled, the word ripped ragged from my throat. "I don't leave my back trail exposed. I don't abandon the innocent. That is the one thing a true man cannot do." She stared at me, eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to find the lie. "You gave your gun. You are finished." "I am not finished," I insisted, shaking my head. The raw conflict inside me was laid bare. I confronted the great weakness of my life, the failure to protect Finn, the failure to stop the corruption in my old cavalry unit. That ghost was the true enemy, and running now meant succumbing to it again. "I need this, I said at last, the thought crashing over me like a flash flood roaring down an empty arroyo. "I need your freedom to prove my own redemption. I need you to find the salvation I've been chasing for 15 years. She watched me, the lines of her face softening, the tension easing from her shoulders. "And if the ground takes us both?" she asked quietly. "Then it takes us both," I answered. "I made a choice at that block. The choice was justice for you, and I will see it through even if it costs everything." She nodded slowly. She had tested me and found my answer. She moved to the mouth of the arroyo, scanning the terrain with the focus of someone who had been born to it. "They split up," she murmured. "2 on the ridge, 3 below." Her military observation startled me. "You know this kind of fight," I said. Her gaze drifted to the far, dusty peaks, the land of the Apache. "My father was a man of the war trail," she replied softly. "I know how men hunt." The air grew heavy, a low, distant roll of thunder crossing the desert like a warning drum. Thorne and his men had found the head of the canyon. They were coming down the dry wash, pinning us against the far wall. The crisis had peaked. We were trapped, weaponless against 5 armed men and a corrupt authority. The consequences of my simple act of honor had finally caught up to us. "Jake Barlow!" Thorne's voice boomed, amplified by the canyon walls, echoing like a curse. "The game is over, old man. Hand over the Daystar, and I'll let you bleed out slow instead of fast." He had used her name, the name I had only heard whispered. The full convergence of our problems, the corrupt lawman, the debt, the lack of a gun, the unforgiving desert, and the desperate vulnerability of the woman beside me had arrived. Sita looked at me one last time, her eyes shining with a determination that mirrored my own. She reached out and placed her hand over my bruised ribs, a simple, non-verbal affirmation of our shared fate. The heat of her palm burned through the fabric like a brand, steadying me. I nodded. No words were needed. We would either choose how we would die or how we would rise. Out here, on this broken edge of the New Mexico Badlands, honor wasn't a word. It was a bullet already in the air, and you either caught it or you didn't. And you, friend, if you're reading this right now, pause for a heartbeat. Take a sip of water. Feel it cool against your throat. Comment 1 and your place below if you want more Wild West love stories, more tales of the Badlands where honor collides with desperation and love rides shotgun with death. Because this isn't just a story, this is a reckoning. BSO. Viết đoạn 4.1300 chữ. I lay prone on the canyon rim, my chest scraping the coarse red sand, the grit biting into my already bruised ribs like 1,000 tiny teeth. Each inhale was a slow burn, a reminder of how fragile flesh becomes when the stakes are higher than any saddle, any burden a man can strap to a horse. The weight of the moment was heavier than all my cavalry gear put together. Below me, framed by the jagged rocks and thin mesquite, two of Thorne's men, Dusty, with his tobacco-stained grin, and a brute named Pike, whose fists had broken more noses than his gun had fired bullets, were scouting the high ground, moving with the swagger of men convinced the desert belonged to them. I watched them from above, my breath held tight and shallow. My muscles ached with age, my knees stiff from old injuries, and my holster was empty. I was old, slow, and weaponless. Yet I still had one thing they lacked: righteous purpose. That purpose beat inside me like a second heart. For 15 long years I had carried it through saloons, across battlefields, in the silent hours after midnight, when a man's failures come to sit heavy on his chest. It had sharpened me like a whetstone does a blade, so that even in my weakness I could still be dangerous when it counted. A sudden clatter of loose rock echoed up the wash, sharp as a rifle crack, drawing Dusty and Pike's attention. It was Sita. My stomach lurched at the sound, but this was part of the plan. She was fast, faster than they expected, and she moved with the surety of someone who had lived on this land, drawing the 3 men below deeper into the arroyo like a coyote luring a hound off its trail. Dusty and Pike turned toward the disturbance, their rifles raised, their backs now fully to the cliff face. This was my moment. The turn I had waited 15 years for, the single instant when a man either stands up to the ghosts that own him or crawls back under their shadow forever. I moved with the calculated ferocity of a man who has already accepted his fate. My body knew what to do before my mind could name it. The hunting knife flashed in my hand, a poor replacement for a gun, but a faithful friend nonetheless. I dropped from the rim onto Dusty from his blind side, gravity lending me all the speed age had taken away. The momentum of my fall snapped his neck before he could even raise his rifle. I felt the crack reverberate up my arms like striking a rotten branch. Pike spun around, terror blooming on his face like a thunderhead rolling over open prairie, but I was already on him, driving the knife deep, twisting with the cold efficiency drilled into me long ago in places where killing was called duty. It was brutal, necessary work, the final challenge every story about honor eventually demands. The killing didn't bring me joy. It brought a cold, professional sense of justice completed, like closing a ledger written in blood. These weren't just Thorne's men, they were the living instruments of the rot he had spread. Each strike of my blade was a nail in the coffin of my cowardice. I took Pike's rifle and pistol, hands shaking only once before steadying. Now armed, the balance of power shifted, the weight of metal anchoring me back into the man I had been, or the man I wanted to become. I fired 2 warning shots into the air, the sharp reports cracking across the canyon like a starting gun. It was both signal and declaration. The fight had entered its true nature. Down in the wash, Thorne knew. His bellow rose up, ragged with rage and disbelief, echoing off the canyon walls until it sounded like the desert itself was cursing my name. "Barlow, you old son of a bitch, you'll pay for that." I stood on the rim, the dusty wind whipping my duster around my legs like a tattered flag. My chest rose and fell, my ribs screaming, but my eyes were steady. The confrontation was inevitable. It had been inevitable from the moment I threw my last dollar onto that auction block to buy Sita's freedom. Thorn sent his 2 remaining men up the canyon, but they were cautious now, shadows darting from cover to cover. I lay flat, steadying the heavy rifle across a rock, remembering every drill from my cavalry days, every breath control, every squeeze of the trigger. I picked them off one by one. The first dropped with a grunt. The second went sprawling into the sand, clutching his thigh, his rifle skittering away. My hands were calm, my heartbeat slow. It was as if the years had peeled back and left only the old soldier, grim and precise. The rifle was a temporary replacement for the Colt I truly sought, but it did its job. And then there was only Thorn. He emerged from the canyon mouth like a bull charging out of a pen, flanked not by his men but by their bodies strewn across the wash. His face was contorted by sweat and pure, blinding wrath, the kind that burns away fear. In his hand, glinting cruelly under the noon sun, he held my former honor, Finn's silver-plated Colt Peacemaker. The sight of it made something tighten in my chest. That gun had once been a symbol of brotherhood, of justice carried out cleanly. In Thorn's hand it was just another instrument of corruption. "You came for this, old man?" Thorn sneered, raising the gun with a flourish. "You came to die for a piece of cheap metal and a dirty Indian?" "I came for justice," I corrected, my voice ringing across the canyon like a church bell. "For Finn, for Cachalo, and for the soul of this land you corrupted." Oh, it was a classic Western duel, but fought not just with lead but with the weight of everything behind us, the accumulated failures and betrayals of 2 decades. Thorn was a better shot, quicker on the draw, but I was focused, fueled by redemption, by the knowledge that some things matter more than survival. And friend, if you've made it this far into our story, I know you're a true heart of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments below. Sometimes the desert listens, and sometimes it answers. Thorn fired first, the bullet whistling past my head, close enough to tug at my hat brim. I moved sideways, drawing his aim, remembering every lesson from the cavalry days when targets weren't paper but men. He fired again. The slug slammed into the rock where my ribs had been a heartbeat before. My hands were steady, my eyes locked. When he paused, to cock the single-action Peacemaker, my gun, my memory, my honor, I fired. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, and my shot was true, tearing through his shoulder with a spray of red that painted the sandstone. He staggered, dropping the Colt, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. I didn't let him recover. I rose from cover, walking toward him with the heavy rifle aimed at his chest. My boots crunched on the gravel, each step an echo of the march I'd taken years ago, away from everything I'd believed. Thorn fell to his knees, clutching his wound, the malice still in his eyes but dimming like the last glow of a dying fire. "You lose, Thorn," I said, my voice empty of hatred, only fact. "The law found you here, the true law, that—" I left him there, wounded, disgraced, and utterly defeated, a living symbol of the collapse of organized evil. There was no gallows here, no jury. The desert had passed its judgment, and I was just its instrument. I bent, picked up the Peacemaker. It felt right in my hand, heavy with the weight of restored honor. The catharsis was profound, a slow unwinding of a coil that had lived inside me for 15 years. The gun was more than steel. It was a promise kept. I turned, seeing Sita emerge from the shadows at the far end of the wash. Her hair was unbound, dark strands lifted by the same dusty wind that had carried our scent to Thorn's men. She walked to the spot where Thorn had first met her father, bent to retrieve a small, carved bone from her pouch, and buried it beneath a cairn of stones. Her hands moved with ritual precision. It was her final act of mourning and respect, closing the circle of her family's tragedy, planting the last seed of grief into the earth, so something else might grow. She looked at me then, a woman transformed, no longer a captive, but free. Her eyes met mine, holding the simple, powerful truth of Wild West love. She wasn't grateful, She was equal. She had stood on her own trail as surely as I had walked mine. "Where do we go, Jake?" she asked, her voice low, carrying across the quiet like a bird call. I looked at the silver colt in my hand, then at the desolate canyon now soaked in the blood of corruption. We couldn't go back to Dusk Ridge. That life was a grave dug for both of us. We couldn't stay here. This place was a cemetery for everything old and rotten. I walked to Rust, who nickered softly as if sensing the shift in the wind, helped her mount, then swung onto the saddle behind her. My hand rested over hers on the reins, warm and solid. I didn't point the horse toward civilization. I pointed it toward the distant, hazy peaks of the Apache land, not the reservation marked on white men's maps, but the free, unexplored territory beyond the horizon. "We ride west," I murmured, my voice rough but certain, resting my hand firmer over hers, "towards the high country, where the air is clean and the law is honest. We start a new life, a new legend, our own Wild West love story." I kicked Rust into a slow trot. The sun was rising, casting long, hopeful shadows across the unbroken land. We rode not away from a threat, but toward a boundless promise, a future of healing and adventure. The plains were vast, the destination unknown, but for the first time in 15 years, my heart wasn't heavy with regret. It was simply full. The trail was long, the west was wide, and our cowboy love stories had just begun. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment, AMEN, below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life. He went to Dust Devil Pass instead, rode away with an Apache bride who chose him as her partner. He came to the town to collect a debt, but instead found himself paying one he never knew he owed. The sun had only just cleared the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains when I rode into the choked main street of Dust Devil Pass, its harsh, yellow light already spreading across the makeshift auction square, where the silver mine owner, a bloated man named Holt, had decided to make his weekly display of power. It was late spring, 1885, and the Arizona Territory had been hard on men like me. The heat was a living thing, a searing blanket that pressed down on the scalp, and the wind was a constant, grinding whisper that carried the taste of red dust and cheap whiskey. My target, a bank robber with a lazy eye and a 500 bounty on his head, was nowhere to be seen. I had set out this morning with a single purpose in mind: find the man, turn him over to the marshal in Tucson, and secure the cash I needed to keep my belly fed and my horse shod through the summer. My name is Silas Vance, 42 years old, tall, my frame lean and hard from 2 decades of riding, fighting, and going without. My face, what little of it showed beneath the brim of my wide crown hat, was cut with the scars of the war, not a bullet hole, but the subtle, weary lines of a man who'd seen the worst of what men do to each other and had chosen silence as his shield. They called me Stone Eye in the territories, and it wasn't for my good looks. The coat I wore was a Union cavalry duster, patched and worn, but it kept the dust off and the secrets in. I carried a Winchester Model 1873 snug in its scabbard, and a Colt single action on my hip tools of a trade that bought a man an empty life, but a clean conscience, if he was careful. I lived alone. That's just a fact of my life now, one I signed the papers for when I buried the last piece of my old self in the mud outside Fredericksburg. The silence of the open country was what I preferred, broken only by the sound of my horse's breath, the creak of saddle leather, and the rare, necessary word I spoke to a town clerk or a bartender. I hadn't thought of anything resembling a future. Not seriously. Not after seeing everything I cared about turn to ash. Dust Devil Pass was worse than most mining towns. The air stank of sulfur, stale sweat, and the rank exhaust of human desperation. Wagons stood crooked, wheels buried deep in the churned red dirt. Men's voices rose over the din shouts of miners, the clatter of hammers, and the ugly sound of a crowd gathering for amusement. I tied my horse to a hitching post, adjusting the loop of my duster at the waist, and walked slowly toward the noise. I moved with a practiced, steady gait, shoulders squared,